So we're following this massive solar storm. The fallout could actually reach Earth today. We're talking about possible problems for satellites, power grids, navigation systems such as GPS. Meteorologist Rob Marciano joining us to break it down and explain. It sounds kind of scary.
Yeah, well, we're entering this period of solar activity that's going to be quite active, not just now, but going forward through next year. And the flare that happened Sunday night, and there was one that happened last Thursday, so it's happening quite often. The flare that happened Sunday night was pretty strong, at least the radiation of it was. And just to give you a reminder, when you have a sunspot, it emits a solar flare that has radiation with it. It also has charged particles, so it's a two-prong event, basically. The radiation gets here a little bit faster. That happened yesterday and last night. Matter of fact, some planes, they don't like to fly over the poles because, one, that messes with the radio communications, and two, the X-rays from this radiation, it's not, you don't want to get zapped with too many X-rays, so some planes were diverted because of that. Now, the charged particle, or this, what we call the coronal mass ejection, CME, travels at 1 million miles an hour. All right, so 93 million miles away. You do the math. It's coming at us right now. So this was not an X flare, thank goodness, but it's very, very close. If this was an X flare, this would be a major event that would trigger wide-scale blackouts.
An aurora is the polar light show produced by charged particles in the Earth's magnetic field. They're beautiful to see, but they're also a reminder that polar regions have the least protection against solar storms. So when a big blast of solar material heads towards Earth, that's precisely where it causes the most havoc. So commercial airlines reroute jets from flying in the North Pole region, where solar storms can disrupt or knock out high-frequency radio communications, cutting off pilots from air traffic control. Scientists have found that solar storms can cause GPS receivers to fail, which is a danger for jets flying in zero-visibility weather or long-distance flights.
Now turn right.
But away from the polar regions where most of us live, it's not likely your car's GPS would malfunction, but high-precision GPS systems just might. That would compromise activities such as stabilizing a floating oil rig or pinpointing a distress call from a mobile phone. A bullseye impact on Earth could knock the power grid offline or produce rogue spikes in electrical currents, tripping key transmission lines or causing irreversible physical damage to large transformers.
It could be bigger and more immediate than the threat of global warming, they say. Earth's magnetic field, which acts as our protective shield in space, has a hole in it. And that could put a lot of our earthly functions at risk. Dr. Michio Kaku, professor and author of the book Physics of the Impossible, is back with us. Professor, how are you? And good morning to you.
Glad to be on the show.
Thanks. Twice in 1 week, man. It's bonus hour. What is this solar shield?
Well, every 11 years, the sun has a temper tantrum. It releases a shock wave, a tsunami of radiation that could wipe out communication, weather satellites, GPS, spy satellites, you name it. It's up there in outer space.
So you're saying that my BlackBerry won't work?
The internet, Fox, television, cable, satellite TV, all of it could get wiped out around 2012. That's when we have the peak of the sunspot cycle. That's when the sun's magnetic field flips. North Pole and South Pole flip, releasing a shock wave of radiation, which will then hit the Earth minutes later, potentially wiping out a good chunk of our satellite communications. We're watching it very carefully now.
Well, Doc, this happens how often, you say?
Every 11 years.
Well, why an 11-year cycle?
It takes 11 years for the magnetic field of the sun to build up enough intensity to begin the flip process, because it slowly revolves in a circle. It's like winding up the windings of a clock. If you wind up the mainspring of a clock too much, it boing, comes out of control. Same thing with the sun's magnetic field. It literally flips every 11 years, releasing a shock wave of radiation. And that means we have to start to think about reinforcing our satellites, building redundant systems, because it means that GPS, the power grid, weather satellites, communication satellites, satellite television, all of that could get disrupted, peaking around 2012.
So your point is we can't do anything about it in space, but we can do something back here on Earth.
That's right.
But backup systems, are companies really doing that?
Well, they're going to have to do it because, see, we scientists made a mistake. We thought that the next cycle was going to be quiet. Well, some of our data was off by a factor of 20, and that's why we're issuing this alert now. We made a mistake. the next cycle, peaking around 2012, will be much more serious than we previously thought. Now, in the past, we dodged the bullet because we didn't have that many satellites up there 11, 22 years ago. Back in 1990, we didn't have that many space satellites.
Well, that makes sense to me. But, you know, I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking, why 2K? I'm thinking it's just a tactic that put a lot of fear in a lot of people. It may have gotten us ready, but there was really no danger in the end.
Well, let's hope that it's a dud. Let's hope that nothing happens. However, what if our communication systems are wiped out? Billions of economic activity could be
do you think anyone's taking this seriously?
I think we're going to have to. The physicists are now sounding the alert. We made the mistake. We made the wrong projection. The next solar cycle will be more intense than previously thought, and an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Now's the time to begin to create redundant systems, reinforce our satellites, build backup systems.
All right. Michio Kaku, the word is out.
You know, when talking about this morning, we all kind of agreed it has that Y2K feeling, like it could happen, but if it doesn't, we're going to spend a lot of money for nothing.
Well, we had a wake-up call just 2 weeks ago, giant auroras, northern lights as far as Michigan and Wisconsin, and that's a warm-up for 2012, 2013, when we hit the sunspot cycle. Every 11 years, the North Pole and the South Pole of the sun flip, releasing a burst of radiation. But every 100 years or so, a monster tsunami from the sun emerges, which could literally cause trillions of dollars in property damage.
2012, that's a presidential election year. We need to keep that in mind. But if I'm walking around out there, as to whose fault it is, or at least the history, who they'll blame. So if I'm walking around, if I'm out sunbathing in a Speedo, will I look like Charles after about 5 minutes out there? Color, anyways. Obviously, I'm not going to look like Charles in a Speedo, but you know what I'm saying. I mean, is it going to really affect us like that?
That just went from bad to worse.
It could paralyze the economy of the planet Earth.
But not from a physical perspective.
Physical perspective, yeah. 1859, we had a gigantic solar storm which knocked out telegraph wires back then, 150 years ago. Yeah. If that had happened today, it would knock out almost all our satellites, knock out power stations. There would be food riots around the country because refrigeration would stop. Airplanes would probably crash without radar. It would paralyze the planet Earth. $2 trillion in property damage. And again, this is a once-in-a-century, once-in-2-century storm. The last one was 1859. But we do have them, and we have to worry about them.
That's a pretty high probability, once in 2 centuries.
Do we get a warning? I mean, is it like, hey, in 2 hours this happens, in 2 days this happens, in 2 weeks this happens? I mean, if the flare takes place, what kind of warning will we have to go to the other side of the Earth?
And who do you sue?
I'll figure that out. I got that one.
Mark can tell you that later.
I got that covered, okay?
This is an act of God.
By the way, Michio, you might want to sign a waiver before you leave because Mark has you on his list already.
You have now put corporate America on notice. They are responsible for taking preparations. Go ahead, sir.
We have virtually no warning. It's like a giant earthquake. You can't predict giant earthquakes. They happen on a scale of once every 100, 200 years. That's what we have to worry about. We physicists have been telling Congress we have to reinforce our power stations. We have to have redundancy in our telecommunication systems, our satellites. Several of our satellites apparently have already been knocked out or at least disrupted because of solar flares. The space station has to worry about solar flares. But a giant one, like I said, could wipe out power stations on the Earth, wipe out communications, the internet, radar, airplane travel. It would be a mess. We'd be thrown back 100 years.
But are any steps being taken to, if God forbid this happens?
In Congress, there is a bill to pass a paltry $100 million. It's stalled in Congress right now. It's an insurance policy. It would cost very little to begin the process of reinforcing our transformers, power stations. And remember, this does happen even periodically. In 2003 in South Africa, 14 power stations were wiped out because a solar flare hit South Africa. In Canada, the city of Quebec was partially paralyzed, again, about 15 years ago because of a solar flare. These things happen, but the monster one is the one that we physicists are worried about.